All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today to have a discussion about the implications of the April 12th elections in Hungary that decisively ended the 16-year rule of Viktor Orbán. Orbán was roundly defeated by young center-right politician Péter Magyar. And we have two experts on Hungary today to discuss the elections and their implications for both the United States and for Europe. So first, since this is my very first webinar in my new position, I'll introduce myself. I'm Kristina Kvien, the President and CEO of the Pacific Council. And I, until January of this year, was the U.S. ambassador in Armenia and started here with the Pacific Council in March. So I'm super happy to be with you all today, and I'm even happier to introduce our two distinguished guests. First, Dave Kostelancik is currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Previously, he was a career Foreign Service officer with deep experience in Europe, including service in Russia, Albania, Turkey, and U.S. missions to NATO and the OSCE. He was DCM and acting ambassador to Hungary from 2016 to 2019. We also have Benjamin Novak, who is an American journalist and researcher specializing in Central and Eastern Europe, with a particular focus on Hungary's political landscape. He reported from Budapest for the New York Times starting in 2018, after covering Hungarian affairs since 2013 with a startup media company that he co-founded. For audience members, we will address questions at the end, so please type your questions in as they occur to you in the Zoom Q&A tool. So with that, let me set the stage by turning to Benjamin first, and then Dave for opening remarks. Benjamin, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, it came to a quiet end. Just before 9:30 p.m. on Sunday, they hadn't even counted 50% of the votes when Viktor Orbán called Péter Magyar. Magyar later described that exchange as very brief. Orbán said congratulations, and Magyar told Orbán that they are now both responsible for uniting the nation. Orbán responded, good night, and hung up. And with that, the 16-year experiment, tired, distorted, and finally exhausted, climbed into its grave. There was no blaze of glory, no final act of grandeur. It didn't end with a bang, but with something much more revealing. Was anticlimactic. It barely managed to whimper. Over the years, Orbán's system has been called authoritarian, kleptocratic, neo-fascist, even feudal. In truth, it was all of those things at once, an ideological jumble held together by a single organizing principle. The regime existed for one purpose only, to keep Viktor Orbán in power. And for 16 years, that is exactly what it did. I'd like to move beyond the usual analysis of Hungary. Yes, Orbán turned Hungary to the EU's poorest and most corrupt member state. Yes, he captured the institutions and bent them to his will. Yes, he drove the economy into the ground. All of that matters, but none of it gets to the central question that makes this tiny country so relevant at this moment. The real question, the one with consequences far beyond Hungary, is this. If Orbán could be defeated, and if he conceded the election, does that mean Hungary was a democracy? To answer that, it helps to begin with what Hungary had actually become under Orbán. After the Second World War, a prominent German legal scholar wrestled with the problem of legality under National Socialism. He proposed a formula to evaluate that issue. And to paraphrase him, he said that law is meant to serve justice and that equality is at the core of justice. When equality is deliberately betrayed in the making of law, the result isn't merely a bad or flawed law. It's something much worse. Such a statute loses the very character of law itself. And a regime built on such a foundation operates in statutory lawlessness. Orbán's system functioned much in the same way with law and with democracy. It retained all the democratic features, but stripped them of democratic substance and intention. Elections existed, parliament existed, opposition parties existed, But all of it was emptied out and redirected toward one end, serving Orbán's hunger for power, control, and wealth. This was a system designed to subordinate everything to that goal. It was a system in which just over 50% of the vote could be converted into a constitutional supermajority. To put that in American terms, think about what it takes to amend the US Constitution. It's deliberately arduous. Supermajorities, constitutional conventions, 2/3 of states, ratification by 3/4 of them. Now imagine living in a country where one man, one unprincipled man, through parliamentary control, can effectively do the equivalent as a matter of routine every single day. It all served one person. That was Hungary for 16 years, and nothing was spared. Orbán understood the formula: maintain the veneer of democracy through control of parliament, and you can govern like a king. Control the press, entrench the clientelist base, shield yourself, your family, your party, and your oligarchs from accountability. Do all of that, and the rest of Europe will hesitate to say plainly what has happened. After all, to admit that an EU member state or NATO ally is no longer meaningfully democratic would be to confront the institutional absurdity of a lie that allows a non-democratic state to exercise veto power inside democratic alliances. But Orbán's system was not built to endure the reality of change. Over time, the costs rose. He became more detached from reality, more erratic, more buffoonish. I would argue that Orbánism peaked around 2020 and has been in decline ever since. As that decline set in, the regime had to resort to ever more extreme measures, ever more often, just to maintain itself. Those actions had to be double booked. And increases in authoritarianism meant decreases in credibility among Hungarians and allies alike. The facade of that stage, with all of its props, everything was just falling over, coming apart. Péter Magyar's rise and the ascent of Tisza required first the political burial of the old opposition. Only then, standing over that grave of an opposition that had long lost its credibility, could Péter Magyar and his Tisza party take on Orbán seriously. And that's one big lesson of how they won. So was Orbán's Hungary democratic? Absolutely not. A regime that weaponizes the state against its own population while plundering the country is not democratic by any serious definition. But is Tisza democratic because it won inside Orbán's undemocratic system? The answer to that question doesn't lie in the fact that people voted and that Tisza won. The road to that victory was anything but democratic. The answer to that question will lie in what Tisza does next, whether it restores not just the institutions of democracy, but whether it will bring back the spirit and purpose of democracy to public life. That's what people voted for. Shortly after Magyar's victory speech, as people partied around the world and in Hungary, Ali Roof, a friend of mine and one of Hungary's clearest voices, said the following: how many lives has this regime and its mercenaries ruined over the last 16 years? How many people were driven from their homeland? How many were humiliated, kept in a state of anxiety, made sick by this system? How many died before they could see this day come? Hungarians cannot repeat the mistake of 1989 and 1990, when those who committed grave wrongs against their fellow countrymen were given a pass just because everybody wanted to believe the country could move on. If that happens again, he said, this will happen again. In closing, and again to briefly answer the question I posed at the beginning of my remarks, Orbán's regime did not fall because it was a democracy. It fell because it was not. And it took 16 years, countless ruined lives, billions stolen from the Hungarian people, a linguistically isolated nation wallowing in the most vile propaganda, and the wholesale beheading of both Fidesz and the old opposition, just to bring a narrow majority of the country to the point of saying no more. Now, I've been at this long enough to have absolutely no problem saying this with the utmost sincerity. There are Americans who defend Orbánism, what he created. Those Americans who defend that moral depravity are liars. And many of them are on the take. whatever their reasons, their inability to speak honestly about what Orbán did and the immense harm he imposed upon Hungarian society betrays a complete and utter lack of character. Beating Orbán required many people to absorb generational costs. They had to embrace risk and discomfort, and they had to confront the reality of what their unprincipled adversaries sought to impose upon them. And Hungarians did just that. You don't have to do that in a healthy democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was both a detailed and eloquent setup for the rest of our discussion. Thanks. David, I'll hand it over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks. I'll just say briefly with regards to Hungary and to the Orbán years, and now the time that we find ourselves in, which I hope and pray is a new era for opportunity for the Hungarian people, for the people of the region, and for all of us who love freedom and support democracy. Over 16 years of the rule of Viktor Orbán in Hungary, the foreign policy of Hungary was transformed from what it had been through years from 1989, a staunch advocate for transatlantic partnership, for European integration, and for collective security under organizations like the OSCE and NATO. Unfortunately, the evolution of Hungarian foreign policy had adverse implications for the United States over time, ones that were at varying points in varying administrations acknowledged, dealt with, confronted in different ways, and at other times not so much so. And that was certainly the case more so than in any other engagement with Russia. The evolution of Hungarian policy under Viktor Orbán over 16 years to that of serving as basically a spokesperson for Russian interests within European institutions, for advocating for Russian policies within the consultations with foreign leaders, including those of the United States, and ultimately for advocating to their own people through captured state media, regurgitating Russian propaganda points, whether from Itar-Tas or Sputnik or RT, and thereby creating a more complicated situation, which Péter Magyar now will have to deal with. But more broadly, there were complications and consequences for the United States by virtue of Hungary's engagement with other neighbors, certainly Ukraine, Hungary's neighbors, Slovakia and Romania, not the least of which through the provision by the Orbán government of millions, over 1 million, Hungarian passports to ethnic Hungarians in neighboring countries, passports which entitled the holder to free travel throughout the European Union, visa-free travel to the United States of America, employment opportunities, a great number of issues and consequences which bear upon the security, the prosperity of the United States as well, too. We could also discuss China, with which Hungary has become quite friendly in the past several years, the close relationship when it comes to the Belt and Road program, Hungarian business, Chinese businesses taking advantage of opportunities in Hungary as well, too. All of this represents a change, a break, an aberration in what had been Hungarian policy for a great number of years. Right now, I see a greater chance for opportunity, for concentration on issues, values, norms, principles, challenges that are common to all of us in the transatlantic community, and certainly to the people in Europe. There's a lot of work that Péter Magyar will need to do to address the remnants, the legacies of the Orbán years, domestically, in relation to neighbors, in relations to institutions, economically, globally. I certainly hope that some of that will begin with addressing the impediments to democracy that have been placed by the Orbán government to freedom of the media, academic freedom, and respect for transparency and the rule of law, not the least of which through the combating of corruption, something which I am confident will have a positive effect on the business community in the United States as they assess again opportunities in Hungary for cooperation between our two countries. I see a lot of opportunity ahead, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot on Péter Magyar's shoulders, great scrutiny from capitals around the world, not the least of which are Beijing, Moscow, and Washington. And I look forward to discussing some of those challenges with you all.
Thank you, David. I think I'll pose my first question to you. Benjamin got at this a bit in his opening remarks, but I'd be interested in your thoughts because during the time when you were in Budapest, not that long ago, 2016 to 2019, Viktor Orbán's support was quite solid. I mean, I used to hear, I was in Ukraine during part of that time, and I used to hear that, Orbán's in there for life. He's got a rock solid support, and there was no real hope for him being defeated in elections. What do you think happened between your departure in 2019 and now?
Well, you're correct, Christine, that when I arrived in Budapest in 2016, there was strong support for Viktor Orbán. There was also a substantial concern about the direction in which he was leading the country at the time. But I think the fundamental underlying foundation for his support had to do, of course, with the economy. In the years after the end of the global financial crisis, the countries of Central Europe, including Hungary, did relatively well. Incomes were rising, unemployment was down, inflation was controlled, investment was coming from European, from American, from other quarters, and all of that provided Viktor Orbán certainly with a solid base of public support. It also gave him additional revenues on which he could draw to support the kind of populist policies that ensured he retained support in the countryside among certain demographics in the country, older voters, etc. But what happened in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, the economy was not doing very well in Hungary. Economic growth flattened and was basically zero for the last 4 years. That certainly contributed to the concerns of voters. The loss of substantial EU revenues, in part because of serious concerns for the rule of law, for media, academic freedoms, for the ability of civil society organizations to operate freely and transparently. That loss of revenue also contributed to economic pressures within the country, which compounded people's concerns about the direction things were going. Much credit needs to be given to Péter Magyar, who is an exceptional politician, who was able to rally groups on the left and the right to him to basically deal with the remnants of smaller parties that had traditionally in 2018, 2022, offered some opposition to Fidesz and Orbán, but which were not able to organize in any effective collective way. Magyar's anger, intensity, tirelessness, indefatigability, after the pedophile scandal in Hungary, which launched him into his role to lead the Tisza opposition, and then ultimately now to take control of the government. He has demonstrated exceptional political abilities, and he has shown great energy, great fearlessness, great confidence in Hungary and the Hungarian people, in restoring dignity and honor for Hungarians who feel downtrodden by the corruption and the absence of rule of law during the Orbán years. And Orbán was just not able to compete with that in the campaign. He looked tired. He could not run on an economic platform because it was a very poor one. He resorted to blaming Ukraine, blaming Brussels for so-called problems of Hungary. He had used those arguments before in 2022. He thought he could use them again in 2026, but people have had enough of that. And between his lackluster performance, the economy's poor performance, and people deciding that they'd had enough of the mismanagement of Hungary under Orbán and Fidesz, that spelled the end for Orbán.
Really interesting insights. Thank you, David. Benjamin, I'd like to turn to you and ask, given your deep understanding of Hungary, your fluent Hungarian, the time you've lived there, what do you feel were driving voter sentiments, both in their long support for Orbán, but then in their very clear turn away from Orbán? I mean, what were the voters thinking, and what is what are the driving motives of the Hungarian voter?
I think David hit the nail on the head to that question in his response. If I could kind of back away from it and do a more kind of bigger picture, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, because of their history, don't just look at the past few years as being kind of like the metric of like what has happened or progress. The end of the Cold War, the transitions in those countries were huge for them. And for many countries, it was a very uphill fight to get on your feet, to be able to adjust to the market economy, to be able to deal with, the pressures of democratic pluralism. Corruption was rampant and everything, and it was a very difficult time. And then on top of that, you had, as David rightly pointed out, the Great Recession that was catastrophic for Central and Eastern Europe. And in Hungary's context, to understand Orbán's rise in 2010, what he campaigned on, what he tapped into, was that disillusionment with the transition. That the communists had somehow survived, and how they had, taken over the system again and had driven it into the ground again. And what he promised was this national rebirth. And that he would deliver that, and everything became singularly about the nation. And for many Hungarians, out of the Great Recession, having that 2 decades of a pretty tough time after the transition, the 1990 transition, I think there was certainly a lot of kind of openness to all right, let's give this a shot. The previous left liberal governments had been pretty bad themselves, corrupt, incompetent. And Orbán had a shot. And so when Orbán came to power in 2010 and he won with a 2/3 supermajority, he won a 2/3 supermajority with the old rules. And that was legitimate by Hungarian law and by everything. And that was accepted as a legitimate victory. But then what happened? He quickly set about rewriting the game so that he didn't have to win by the old rules anymore. And every election after that, he won with a 2/3 supermajority. And over time, that meant him taking over the institutions, him doing what he wanted, him building up a political economy within the country that all served him staying in power. And here I'd like to kind of put a kind of fine note on that Hungarians, because of their history, are incredibly proud of their uprisings in 1848, 1849 against the Habsburgs. They're very proud of their uprisings against the Soviets in 1956. And for Viktor Orbán himself, who came onto the political stage right before Hungary's democratic transition in 1989, embodying the legacy of 1848, 1849, and 1956 was what gave him his political identity. He told the Russians to leave Hungary. So there was always this very antagonistic, or Hungarians were not too fond of any imperial Russia because of this, and so that was something that was very much a part of Viktor Orbán's identity. And what we saw after 2010 was Viktor Orbán completely changed. It wasn't anymore that Viktor Orbán saw an imperial Russia as an adversary or as a threat. He began to see that as a reliable trading partner. If I want to give it, the best intention kind of, assumption of what motivated him, that would be one way. And I think that contrast crystallized first in 2014 when Russia seized Crimea, and I think most visibly on February 24th, 2022. And it was just impossible for Viktor Orbán to square that circle. And I think for many Hungarians, that was a shock. And to help square that circle, Viktor Orbán had to increase the propaganda. It had to become more wild and more crazy and more over the top. And I think on top of everything that David said, which was entirely correct, I think one of the very important lessons was that a fatigue had set over Hungarian society. Sure, he had a very strong base, but everybody was just tired of it. A government that cries wolf all the time and no wolf ever comes, and you just stop taking it seriously. And all of these factors converged, I believe. 2024 was a game changer. Viktor Orbán had 2 years earlier won another 2/3 constitutional supermajority. And because of that, the opposition had completely been wiped off. There was zero credibility. Nobody understood what the opposition was actually doing in parliament. And then we had a series of crises, political crises in Hungary that exposed the moral bankruptcy of the regime in a way that truly shocked the conscience of many Hungarians, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum. And that's when Péter Magyar came in. When you have crimes against children and the government is actively involved in the covering up of those crimes, there isn't a single person who has an ounce of morality in their heart who looks at that and says, this is okay. And Péter Magyar tapped into that, and he credibly tapped into it. And those kinds of scandals didn't stop coming out. And what we saw over time as Fidesz began to lose more and more of its credibility is that more and more people started to speak up. You began to see much elite defection, is what the political scientists would call them, but you would see people risking quite a bit to come out publicly and say, this is what I see happening in the state. I can't be a party to this anymore. And you take that, you juxtapose it with the lived experience on the ground in Hungary, and what you see is a regime that was coming apart at the seams. And Péter Magyar, there's a lot of discussion about, is he a right-wing, is he a left-wing guy? I think that's beside the point. When you get to that place as a community that Hungary was in, there is no such thing as left or right. There's black and white. And I think Péter Magyar brilliantly tapped into that. And he's a guy who woke up every morning, and for 3 years, that regime that had destroyed oligarchs, that didn't bow down, that had destroyed news organizations and everything, that regime threw the kitchen sink at this guy every single day for 3 years, and he didn't stop. And I believe Hungarians were inspired by that. For once, they felt like, here's a guy who can deal with this. And he went straight into the Fidesz stronghold. He showed Hungarians how people in the country were living. And those who previously didn't have a voice, he gave a voice to them. That's not to say that others weren't doing that in Hungary. I think we're oftentimes rightly critical of the opposition, but I think we often don't talk about those who risked a lot and took a lot of flack for somehow keeping the problems of society in focus. And in this regard, I think civil society and independent media in Hungary served an incredibly important role for many, many years. And I, for one, as an American, am proud to say that my government did something to help them out. There was no editorial control or anything. The simple helping hand, being able to give them space to breathe and to adjust to this new climate, to continue their purpose, I think had played an enormous role in kind of creating the conditions that allowed for Péter Magyar later and many, many others to seize the moment and deliver this to the Hungarian people.
Thanks, Benjamin. You alluded to this, my next question, actually, in your response, but I'd like to drill in a little bit more on that. And maybe, David, I'll ask you to go first, but I'd like to hear from both of you on this one. I have heard, and I think others have reported, that there's a little concern that Péter Magyar is not really all that much different than Orbán, or that he might not actually be as different as perhaps Europeans or Ukraine would like him to be. I assume both of you either know him or, know of him quite well and know his history. What is your view on that? Do you think, because my understanding is when he was in the EU, working in the Hungarian mission to the EU, they called him the little Orbán. So do you think that he really is going to break from Orbán's policies? How do you think he's going to be with Ukraine or the EU? I'd be interested in your thoughts. And Dave, if you could start.
Sure. I'll start. I think my assessment is that given all the constraints that we've been discussing, that Péter Magyar confronts as he assumes leadership in Hungary, economic troubles, challenges with the European Union, challenges with neighbors. I think, not to mention, for any leader, the global environment and situation in which all countries now find themselves, whether that be as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the conflict in the Middle East or other challenges. I think he is going to exhibit, at least initially, a quite pragmatic approach to foreign policy. I think you've seen that already in some of his comments to the press regarding Russia, the issue of Russian energy, as well as he has stated his opposition to the Russian continued invasion and fighting in Ukraine, coupled with his willingness not to stand in the way of the 90 billion euro loan essential for Ukrainian finances for the next long period of time. I think he's certainly helped by the fact that insofar as that loan entails or involves no liability, interest, or repayment obligations on the part of Hungary, as well as Slovakia and the Czech Republic, this will be something on which he can demonstrate to Brussels, to his future fellow colleagues there, that he is understanding of the work that has gone into preparing this, that he is supportive of it. But you couple that with the complex situation that we've been discussing as well for him domestically, a population that has been fed a diet of Russian propaganda for years now. I'm not saying that all Hungarians buy what they've seen or read or heard, hook, line, and sinker, but it's had an impact. And it's a reality that Magyar is going to have to deal with. So when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Russia, I'm anticipating a pragmatic approach that will enable him to demonstrate to European institutions that he is ready to turn a page on the Orbán obstinacy and obstruction, but there are some limits to that. Russia is complicated because of the energy nexus for Hungary, oil, gas, and not to forget nuclear energy as well, too. There may be some opportunities for the United States going forward, for example, with regards to nuclear energies, SMRs, for Hungary, but there's a lot that still needs to be worked out in that regard, and the agreement with Russia to build the Paks 2 nuclear facility is going to have to be dealt with in one way or another. Oil, gas, there are opportunities there too for weaning Hungary off of Russian energy sources, and I think that will be important to demonstrate in solidarity with Ukraine, in solidarity with the direction that broader EU and European policy is going, but it's going to take time and is going to be slow in coming. I think when it comes to European institutions that others in Europe, in the United States, will judge Magyar versus Orbán on the basis of receptivity, cooperation, engagement, acceptance, acknowledgement of norms, values. I anticipate Magyar to break with the past of Orbán, to work more closely, in particular with the European Prosecutor's Office, institutions in Europe, that can be of benefit to him domestically in helping to get at the rampant corruption and to begin to demonstrate to the international business community and to others that Hungary, once again, is addressing corruption, adhering to rule of law, and putting in place a system that investors will feel confident about. I think we'll see. We have to wait for a little bit until June to see, I think, the first interactions between Magyar and his European colleagues. I know there's a European informal council next week. Whether Magyar would come or not, notwithstanding that Orbán and Foreign Minister Szijjártó have declined to participate and represent Hungary at that event. But I really think that we're going to see on a pragmatic level slow, demonstrable steps by Magyar that will distinguish him from Orbán.
It's a great question. Starting off with the first half that has to do with Péter Magyar and the personality. I guess for those of you who aren't aware of his background, Péter Magyar could be described as a Hungarian who kind of grew up within the upper echelons of the Hungarian political elite. And, very close ties to Fidesz. His ex-wife is a former justice minister for Viktor Orbán. And he did have this diplomatic stint in Brussels at the firm rep, at the Hungarian firm rep. And this idea that he's just like a Viktor Orbán. All I can say to this is that he wouldn't be the first man to convert on the road to Damascus. And I think what he has demonstrated over the past 3 years in Hungary was his ability, or a desire at least, to show penance in some kind of way. And more than 3 million Hungarians felt that that was an honest enough attempt that they would cast their votes and make their own sacrifices for him. As it relates to Hungary's role with the European Union, with NATO, and regionally, just not having Orbán is already a huge thing. Orbán's foreign policy, and there may be some dispute on this, and maybe in another event with David, we can kind of attack this idea. I don't believe that Orbán truly wanted Hungary to be part of the European Union. I don't believe that he wanted Hungary to be part of NATO. I think these were more obstacles for him than anything else. And I think just by virtue of having a prime minister sit in the council who is not there to blackmail, to block, to undermine, is already going to be a huge improvement, not just for Hungary, but I think in the EU's ability to make policy going forward. That said, the EU is not perfect by any stretch. And I think to the extent that Péter Magyar and the Hungarians have problems with EU policies, finally, they will have a prime minister who will hash it out with them. I certainly hope that's the case. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think that's actually quite good. You won't have a prime minister who is actively undermining the security of a nation next door that is being besieged by a nuclear superpower. These things matter. You won't have a prime minister who is destabilizing the Balkans. You won't have a prime minister who is playing a shield or backup or veto in Slovakia. I think all of these things matter, and this will change Hungary and end its relationship to everybody as a result. Yeah, that's kind of leave it there. We can move on.
Thank you, both David and Benjamin. My last question before we move to the question and answer, and I see there are some questions there that I'd like to get to, is what's the implication for U.S. relations? It was pretty clear. President Trump publicly endorsed Viktor Orbán. Vice President Vance went to Budapest shortly before the elections, very strongly again endorsed Viktor Orbán. Do you think that our bilateral relations can get past that and be constructive? David, if you go first. David, I think you're muted.
Hello? You can hear me? Okay, great. I think the fact that President Trump has already made a statement saying, well, I think we could probably work with Viktor's successor is a positive first step. I think, though, that it's going to take time to work this out. I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I think what we have to remember and focus on is not just the opportunities for U.S.-Hungarian relations that are orchestrated or driven by the capitals, but the relations that are driven by people, by civil society organizations, by business actors, by military actors. The great partnership between the state of Ohio and its National Guard and the Hungarian military is one that has withstood the Orbán years. There is enormous, I think, hope that once again, Hungary can begin to engage with this broad range of actors, not just at a national level, but at a state, city level, business, people to people, with the United States in ways that will really yield results. I'm very hopeful that there will be progress moving forward, particularly in the academic realm, in light of the disaster of Orbán policy that resulted in the departure for teaching purposes of Central European University from Budapest and inflicted untold other kinds of damage on many of the major academic institutions across Hungary, having implications then for their engagement with foreign partners in Europe and the United States. I'm hopeful that there's going to be an opportunity to rebuild that, that the Magyar government will understand that the laws and regulations put in place by the Orbán government have hurt Hungary, have hurt Hungarians, and that it's time that Hungary reconnect with the rest of the world. It's going to be slow going on other matters. I think, as we've discussed, as Magyar distinguishes himself from the policies of Viktor Orbán, which were more to the liking of the Trump administration when it comes to Russia and perhaps at times as well Ukraine. As he, I hope, shows his solidarity with his neighbors, with Poland, with the V4, which has definitely lost some oomph and significance in the last several years, an organization, an institution that the United States for a great many years supported and saw as making valuable contributions in Central Europe. I think as all this happens, we're going to have to see what the attitude of Washington is. But I can tell you that aside perhaps from the White House, in other quarters in Washington, certainly in the Congress, there has traditionally been bipartisan support for a policy that has called Russia to account for its democratic failings, has called Hungary to account for its leniency vis-a-vis Russia, called Hungary to account for its snubbing of institutions in Europe and for all kinds of other questions. I'm hopeful that that bipartisan solidarity will reemerge now that we have a democratic partner in place in Hungary, and that we can engage with them on this broad range of establishing our relations on these pillars of support.
Thanks, David. Benjamin?
It's a great question. How will this affect the bilateral relationship? How will this affect the transatlantic relationship? I mean, I wouldn't so much start from Hungary's perspective. I think we need to look at what's happening in our own country and ask ourselves, what do our leaders think about the transatlantic relationship? What do they think about European security? I don't think. I mean, to be fair, Hungary is a small, not wealthy country. Its military is the size of a police force at a major metropolitan city in the United States. So what is the strategic utility of engaging with Hungary as the Trump administration has? I'm not entirely sure. But what I can say is that it seems to me that Orbán's policies seem to dovetail quite nicely with this administration's posture on Ukraine and Russia. I think perhaps the Trump administration saw in Orbán what Vladimir Putin saw in Orbán, an agent that can destabilize Europe, that can advance their interests within the European architecture. I think that's totally possible. Orbán thought that the election of Donald Trump would save him from his decline. Before the 2024 elections in the United States, Viktor Orbán had, enthusiastically campaigned for President Trump. He said that President Trump would bring peace to the world, and that peace would mean Hungary's economy can get back on its feet. And let's take stock of what's happened since then. So it seems that not only did Orbán tragically misread the situation, but he did so in a way so publicly that also undermined his credibility domestically. I don't think that Donald Trump cares all that much about Viktor Orbán. He endorsed him, but as soon as Viktor Orbán lost, he threw him aside. It didn't matter all that much. I think for this administration, what they see, whoever sees any potential or something worth saving about Orbán, probably the vice president and some of his people in his orbit. We know that because several of them are on Mr. Orbán's payroll in Hungary. We'll see for how much longer. I think what will affect the relationship, I think disclosures from the incoming government in Hungary about some of the payments that have been made to certain political actors in the United States will be quite interesting. I think that there might be a point of tension there. That'll be fascinating to watch. At this point, if Péter Magyar sees the transatlantic relationship not as beginning with Hungary's relationship with the United States, but with Hungary's role within the European Union and within NATO, I think we're going to have, I think there's a lot of potential there for kind of this healthy growth. This reliance on the United States historically, and especially now, it's quite obviously been like the terrible policy for Europeans in general. But right now, if they can close ranks in Europe, and there will be a Hungary that identifies with that and understands the strategic importance of European unity, I think that will. I'm very optimistic for the future of Europe, with or without the United States. If you don't have countries who are causing trouble, like Orbán caused trouble.
Thanks. So we're running quite short of time, but I would like to get to at least one question. And the one that really struck me as interesting from Brewer Stone, let's see here, hit the button. The question is, in their book, Assault on the State, Hansen and Kopstein argued that Hungary under Orbán destroyed the legal rational state system in favor of a highly personal, loyalty-based system of governance, patrimonialism. Presumably that means that Orbán loyalists remain throughout governing institutions today. Can Magyar really change this and return Hungary to the rule of law versus men? To me, to sum up this question, is there a deep state in Hungary that is going to work against Magyar in his time in office? Who would like to? I'm going to let you guys decide which one takes that first.
I'm happy to, Dave, if that's all right with you. So, yes, is there a deep state? Absolutely, there is a deep state, as we've kind of we've been able to understand that word. I think what's very important to realize here is that Péter Magyar and the Tisza party have a constitutional supermajority. Whether or not people recognize the gravity of that is a separate question. What we see already is that Péter Magyar has been signaling, sometimes more carefully, other times, as in the case with the president of the republic, more overtly, that you need to resign. One way or another, you're not going to be in office. So you can go out and, hold on to what remaining dignity you may have or you think you have, or we can do it the hard way. And I think that is hugely important. This is that big of a victory. The clientelism, Orbán created a system that he funded with state money to generate propaganda and to give everybody jobs and to throw money around. If you look at some of the biggest companies on the Budapest Stock Exchange, these are companies that were taken over, bought up by Mr. Orbán's very close allies, some would say straw men. They were propped up with state money, with easy contracts, didn't have many deliverables, but they became massive companies in Hungary. What happens the second the money stops flowing? How over-leveraged are you? Is a bailout needed? What about all of these hundreds of propaganda media outlets that will no longer receive state funding? Are you going to pay for that? Or take public media, financed to the tune of billions of dollars. What happens when all of a sudden you can't do that anymore? I think people will be reading, the writing's on the wall. Some of them, as we've seen recently in Péter Magyar's first interviews on public media in Hungary this week, you have propagandists who speak to him. The analogy that came to mind for me was, I read these stories long ago about how after the Second World War, there were Japanese soldiers stuck on island in the jungles. They never knew the war ended. And then somebody found them like a year later, and these guys thought the war was still going on. That is the reaction you're seeing from a lot of propagandists in Hungary. It's coming to an end. It will be very difficult to unwind a lot of these relationships, but the beauty of it, and what I think makes this regime change so remarkable in Hungary, and the great lesson we can learn from it, everybody in every democracy, is that there comes a point in which people say this has to be done. And we've taken the punches to get this far. We'll take the punches to move ahead in the future. And that resounding victory that Péter Magyar has, that is exactly what it is built on. So I'm optimistic. I think if he's anything like Orbán, as one of the previous questions raised earlier, I would be fascinated to see how a not corrupt, dictatorial Orbán who wants to get things done and has a supermajority solve this problem. So I'm quite optimistic.
Well, thanks so much. We are at the end of our time. I could go on with this discussion for at least another hour. It's been amazing to talk to you both. The depth of your knowledge and experience is great. I've learned a lot. I think our members that tuned in have learned a lot. So a huge thanks to you both. Let's keep an eye on what goes on in Hungary and Europe. I think it's a really exciting time. Thanks again.